The other conversation we want to have today, because now that we're only down to this one series, we can talk about some more big picture stuff. And I think this is a fun one, is ranking the top 5 duos in the NBA, because we are very much in a duos league right now, Logan. The days of the big 3 are no more. Look up and down the teams that were in the conference finals. Look at sort of the star pairings that are forming. It's a whole lot of duos out there, and we've got them still going. Tatum and Brown, Jimmy and Bam, Jamal Murray, Nikola Jokic. So who do you have in that number 5 spot right now for the best duos in the league?
I think I'm going to go, and this is edging out Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. I think I've got Giannis Antetokounmpo and Drew Holiday. You know, Giannis always up there for one of the best in the league, two-way. Giannis, I have my frustrations with, and you saw the crux of the Giannis slander here. He's not a late-game guy, and he's just not a perimeter initiator, period. You know, it's not just good offense. He's a tank. He's a guy who doesn't really have a wealth of, moves in his bag, but at the end of the day, Giannis is still one of the best defensive players on planet Earth, and that's where the crux of this argument goes. Drew and Giannis are one of the best defensive duos in the league, and people rag on Drew and his offensive game too. Look, man, I don't know if people forgot during the playoff run where they ended up winning the title against Phoenix. Drew came up really big in those playoffs, especially as a downhill guy, just putting his head down, getting to the rack, getting big buckets when this team needed. I know that our view can be a little tainted because of what we saw during this playoff run, but Drew's a really good offensive piece. He can set the table for guys. I mean, he had multiple games where he's really high in assists during this run. He is a legitimate playmaker. He's a good pull-up scorer and shooter at times. I know that wanes from time to time, but he's a well-rounded scorer. He's a great playmaker. He's one of the best defenders on planet Earth, and so is Giannis. And so I know because they're still not in the playoffs, because they got dogged by the Heat in round 1, maybe some people wouldn't have this duo here. They actually bumped Tatum and Brown for me. I have Giannis and Drew Holiday at my 5 spot.
I would have him even higher. And I do agree. We saw their greatest flaw exposed in that disappointing loss to Miami, which is that neither of them are great clutch half-court offensive creators. They are not in that top echelon of offensive skill when you're talking about guys who can just run pick and roll and get you a great look no matter what, or create a great pull-up jumper for themselves out of isolation. And that costs them dearly, and that is real. They also won a title 2 years ago, and I think Giannis is still clearly a top 3 player alive. We can elevate Jokic and Steph above him because those guys are generational one-man elite offenses, but I don't think anybody else in basketball is in that same tier. I don't think that a Kevin Durant has shown the ability to single-handedly elevate an offense to that top tier. Joel Embiid certainly, I think, has far too many playoff issues. And so you go up and down the list, and it's tough for me to make an argument for anybody other than those two above Giannis. Because, yeah, issues get exposed in the postseason, but in his last 2 postseasons, he looked like the best player on the planet. Had a historically great final series against Phoenix where he puts up 35 and 15 and has otherworldly defense and is wildly efficient offensively. And then last year, shorthanded without Chris Middleton against Boston, I thought reached the highest level we've ever seen from him as a playmaker, where he's putting up over 7 assists a night and is dissecting them, trying to build up such an aggressive wall, throwing such aggressive help at him, while still getting his 34 a night with like okay efficiency. And ultimately, as physically taxing as that approach was on him, barreling into the paint over and over and then either finishing himself or kicking out when he draws help, it felt like he wore down the Boston defenders more than vice versa. So Giannis is a special offensive player with his sheer force, his transition dominance, and he is one of the best defenders alive. And I think that this makes a very strong case for the best defensive duo alive. And Drew just had one of his best career offensive seasons. Really good playmaking, was able to actually float the ship in stretches where Giannis was hurt, was an awesome shooter for a majority of the year. He's almost 38+% from deep, and then comes to the playoffs and he's 28% from deep, right? So a shooting variance like that over a 5-game sample, I don't want to completely reshape our view of this guy. So overall, I think you have a top 3 player. I think you have the best two-way duo in the league. Yes, they are flawed, but I would still have them at my number 3 duo. My number 5 duo is actually Jimmy and Bam. I also do not have Tatum and Brown, and I think that Tatum and Brown make a legit case when they're firing on all cylinders. But I do think there's an inconsistency that exists with them because of their reliance on perimeter shot making. I think the playmaking limitations are very real. Jaylen is just not an overly good decision maker to begin with, and Tatum ebbs and flows. Sometimes he dissects traps, sometimes he collapses at the sight of them. He's certainly not in that upper echelon of playmakers around the league, and we know that his confidence can leave him at times. His willingness to get downhill is not as consistent as it should be. So I just think the lack of like a dominant tier 1 guy too, I'm not putting Tatum there. It feels like every duo above them for me has a significant edge, either defensively or offensively. And I just think if you put any other duo with Boston's supporting cast on my list, is there a question they'd win the NBA title? Like, there's just a level of dependability, of multifaceted impact that a lot of these other duos reach that I don't quite think Tatum and Brown do, but they're young, they're still improving, and hey, balling right now, obviously trying to make history. I do have Jimmy and Bam, and maybe this seems low to some people, but I think it's fair. Jimmy, obviously, come playoff time, is going to play like a top 8 guy, and I think is one of the great playoff risers of all time because he has so many skills that translate so well. His physicality, his ability to always play at his own tempo, right? Okay, I've got a switch. Great. Let me just hunt exactly the shot that I want out of pick and roll. Let me just weave my way to a beautiful look from mid-range. His mid-range game is extremely valuable, and his scoring in the lane, the ability to create those looks within 12 to 15 feet. Again, not relying on that perimeter shot making like some other wings, can tend to be good playmaking and consistent top-end defensive impact, some of the most genius defensive playmaking, and just constant grit, competitive instincts, intangible kind of things. It makes him a top 8 guy in the playoffs. There's no question about that to me. And Bam is playing very good basketball right now and is a good scorer off the roll, right? Really good athlete and a guy who can kill you with that touch finishing, with that mid-range shot making, but overall it's not an elite weapon. Like, he's going to shoot in the mid to high 30s from mid-range. Teams are mostly going to deal with him in single coverage and live with that. But then again, we saw today Boston throwing some doubles at him, and that was flustering him a bit. So he is awesome defensively, highly switchable, but able of holding down that paint at a really high level too. I just feel like compared to my next duo, which I guess I'll just spoil for the sake of this point, is AD and LeBron, Bam is further behind the ADs and Brons of the world than Jimmy is ahead of them. And I think offensively, they are lacking a bit compared to some of the other duos on my list. So I went back and forth with this. I think there's a real case for them to be higher, but that's where I have them. So who do you have in your 4 spot?
At 4, I've got Jimmy and Bam here. And I also want to say, too, Tatum and Brown are my second duo off. I actually have Steph Curry and Wiggins in my number 6 spot. You know, I think that's the delineation I would make between Jimmy and Bam and the other guys being above them is there's still a lack of a great offensive engine in the sense that night to night, you know, I know what Jimmy can do in the playoffs. Like you said, Jimmy concretely elevates his game every single year in the playoffs, but I think to be in that upper echelon, you need a guy that is just rock solid, that is just dependable, that is going to get your offense to greater heights. That's the thing that makes Jimmy and Bam special is defensively, yeah, I think they're maybe the second or the best defensive tandem. You know, you can argue Giannis and Drew. I mean, Jimmy and Bam are right up there. And I'm tired of the Bam slander, too, because it's like, I just don't get why the Heat aren't good for 2 years back-to-back, and then we all just forget that Bam Adebayo exists when he is one of the most versatile, switchable guys, when still being a great rim protector. Bam's great, and this is one of the best defensive duos on planet Earth. I am going to hold Bam's offensive limitations against him, though. Bam does a lot of things great, right? He's a guy that you can run DHOs through. That's why this Miami offense has been so great in these playoffs, creating easy pull-up looks off of him. He's a great playmaker out of the short roll with his back to the basket. And night to night, we've seen sometimes his shot making is on. Sometimes he can hit some deep elbow jumpers, some mid-range stuff. When Jimmy was out and injured earlier this year, Bam took over offensively and really showed the depth of his offensive game. But again, there are still limitations. Bam's not going to be an offensive hub, and without Jimmy, he's just not a great offensive piece. I think to be in the upper echelon of this list of duos, you need to be a great offense first. But I don't want to undersell them. Jimmy and Bam, I think, have to be top 5. And I don't know, maybe like you said, the conversation's kind of swung in a different direction where people are saying they're 1 and 2. I'm not going to go that far yet, but I don't want to undersell them. They're a very special tandem. And with Jimmy, when Jimmy is really on, yeah, they're probably higher night to night. But consistently, I'd have them 4.
Yeah, and maybe there are some people who will say, well, how could you have them below Giannis and Drew like I do when they just outplayed them in their first round series? Which to me is just, again, a matter of sample size. Like, it was 2 games. It was 2 games where Giannis was actually out there. Jimmy was unbelievable, a god, 2 of the best games that I've ever seen played in the playoffs. But bottom line, who do you think is a better basketball player? I think an overwhelming majority of us will take Giannis in that conversation. And Drew also just played very poorly in those couple games, not up to his level. So I think it comes down to what level can Bam consistently reach offensively, and he doesn't answer that question decisively enough for me to move them higher. I do have AD and Braun at number 4, and I think that they're a tricky one to place because there's a dynamic of inconsistency with them for various reasons, right? Like LeBron this season, under 31% from deep across the regular season and the playoffs, as he is more reliant on that perimeter shot making than ever before as a matter of conserving energy, basically. And so when that shot is off, he's limited. And that shot was off too much this year. And he's not dominating games for 48 minutes. He's not running high volume pick and roll. He's not always engaged defensively. And then AD, 6 games these playoffs, he goes under 20 points. And he's not a consistent high-end scorer, right? The aggression isn't always there on the interior. The skilled shot making at times will come and go. It's not an elite trait of his, and the perimeter game just doesn't exist right now. Like, everything is sort of within 15 feet. And obviously is not an overly impactful playmaker. So those 2 guys in this playoff run, we saw some very high highs and we saw some lows that were lower than they should be. But overall, I don't want to overreact to this team getting swept by a historically great offense and a team that was just better than them top to bottom, because I think there's a lot of teams that could have met that fate, and they were competitive in all 4 games. I think AD is still a generational defender. I referred to him as the best defender in the world recently, and everybody had a collective conniption over that, as if that wasn't the consensus 2 weeks ago, as if he hadn't completely dominated 2 playoff series and was averaging 4 blocks a game and forcing offenses to adjust their approaches as much as possible just to stay away from AD in the paint or to bring AD out of the paint. And then he gets torched by the best player alive, and that's supposed to change my outlook. It doesn't really. Nobody was going to guard Jokic ever. Nobody is. If you think Bam is, if that ends up being the finals matchup, I think you're in for a rude awakening, because I think that Jokic would make food out of him one-on-one too. But he propelled them to the best defense in this playoff field through 2 rounds. He held people in this run 16% below their typical field goal percentage at the rim, the best of any volume rim protector, over 3 blocks a game, while having the best hands defensively of any big. 1.4 steals per game in this run. We saw how important that was with him playing that high drop against the Warriors, his ability to still affect passing lanes, his ability to affect people around the rim and their finishing, both with his shot blocking and with his ability to poke balls out. Like, he's just a special defensive player who does have a very high offensive ceiling when his touch shot making is on and when he's consistently committed and aggressive. We saw there was a 9-game stretch this year, Logan, where he averaged 35, 15 and over 3 blocks a game. It was on like 72% true shooting as well. But if you just take out the efficiency, that was still a run that we've never seen anybody have. Akeem, David Robinson, Shaq, nobody. Wilt did it 40 times, I'm sure, but they didn't keep track of blocks officially. So I don't want to undersell Anthony Davis. He has real limitations, real things to be frustrated about, and we saw a lot of them in this past series, but I do still think he's a top 10 player. And then the best version of LeBron, we just talked about last episode, still feels like he's capable of being a top 5 player. When you look at Game 6 against the Warriors, Game 4 against the Nuggets, when he is willing to be physical, when he is willing to bang bodies down in the post. I mean, he created 1.2 points per possession out of post-ups this year. As a scorer or a playmaker, it's just automatically great offense. He's too strong, too skilled, too smart, too capable as a passer. Really good transition weapon still. Remarkably, at 38, still a very good defender when he wants to be. So in those do-or-die moments, he's just spectacular. And if this duo were more consistent overall, they'd be higher for me, but I think that's a legitimate gripe. I think it's something that came back to bite them. They couldn't match the consistency of the Nuggets stars in that series, and it just so happened to be that in the first 2 series, they were better by enough, and their supporting cast were better by enough that they got away with it. In this one, they couldn't, so I can't have them higher than 4, but I do feel good about them here. Who do you have at 3?
Yeah, I have AD and LeBron here at 3, and maybe there's a bit of a logical inconsistency. I said you need to have a real, high-level offensive engine to be really high on my list, so maybe Giannis does fit here more consistently logically, but I think there's enough of a gap between AD, LeBron, and Drew Holiday, for me to make this a real conversation. That being said, though, that's the biggest reason that AD and LeBron aren't higher on my list is consistency and then availability, right? There's a reason that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George aren't super high on my list, right? Because they're one of the best duos in basketball when available. But that's the biggest thing, man. You'll learn as you go through life, right? Availability is one of the most important things that you can have as
I think there's
student.
a saying for that, Logan.
The best availability is the best ability is availability. I had it on the second time.
There you go.
But if that's as an employee, as a kid going to school, just showing up is one of the biggest things. And so it's hard to rank a guy like Kawhi and PG, who are constantly injured, up on this list. And so it's hard for me to rank a guy like Anthony Davis, who is consistently injured or consistently off, and LeBron, who is consistently not his best self. I think there's a real argument that you could make that these two guys, on their best nights, they're the best duo in basketball. I think you can make that a real conversation. We just don't see it consistently enough. And Carson, you mentioned it. I mean, LeBron on post touches, LeBron was the best post scorer in all of these playoffs. Like, it wasn't even close. You can throw Joel Embiid out there, Jokic. I mean, these guys are great. LeBron, statistically, by points per possession, was the best post-up scorer in all of these playoffs. Anthony Davis, we had this debate, about a week ago. I think Anthony Davis just had the best defensive playoff run of anyone in my lifetime, at least that I've consciously watched. I can't think of anybody else who was more dominant defensively. Again, the reason that I can't have them higher is because of consistency and availability, but I don't know, man. There's something that, I know LeBron can be a real offensive engine when he's on, and I know Anthony Davis is the best defensive player alive. I just wish, damn, man, I just wish LeBron was a little bit younger and in the prime of it. I wish we could see this duo at their peak prowess because it would be something special to behold. But I just think there's a level of offensive ease with my two duos that are higher than LeBron and AD that I just value a lot more than I do when these guys can be so inconsistent. AD is never going to be a real offensive engine. LeBron is on the tail end. Night to night can be that. The duos that I have higher, consistent, easy offense, which I just value just a little bit more.
I agree there, and I think it's funny that you say that you wish that we could see the better versions of AD and LeBron, because I don't know if you remember this, Logan. We did, and they actually won a title when they were both top 3 players on the planet. My number 2 spot, I will just jump to because I have Giannis and Drew at number 3, and we already talked about that enough, is Devin Booker and Kevin Durant, because I think that this is probably the only duo out there with 2 consistent top 10 players. Like, again, AD and Braun are both capable of reaching that ceiling on any given night, but there's also a lot of nights where they don't look like top 10 players, either one of them. And I think that this duo is probably getting overly criticized because of how they went out in Game 6 against Denver, but the reality is that they were just outclassed by a much better team in that series. They got outplayed by the best players for Denver, too. I mean, Jokic was a class above either one of them in this series, but for the most part, they played out of their minds. And in this playoff run overall, they had an offensive rating of 119.2 when they shared the court. They combined for 63 points and 13 assists per game on 53, 42, 89 splits. And they did all that with an overwhelming offensive burden, with poor spot-up shooting alongside them, with no other real creators, without particularly good finishing bigs or any sort of rim pressurers at all. Like, it was a special display of shot making, and Book is the guy who deserves the majority of the credit for it, and you can say that it was an outlier shooting run for him, because it was 51% from deep. That's not normal, even for Devin Booker, as awesome a scorer as he is. But he was nearly 59% effective field goal percentage on pull-up jumpers in this playoff run, which is just ridiculous, and with mostly really good playmaking, over 7 assists a game. And talked about some of the moments he had in that Denver series where he sees Jokic coming in the high drop, and he sees that a low man has had to rotate over to be able to tag the roller, and he is just directly whipping those skip passes over to the weak side corner. That's advanced stuff, and that's stuff that is the key to becoming a great offensive engine. Not just a great scorer, but a great offensive engine who is going to dominate individually and elevate those around him. And that's why I think Book has to be a top 10 player right now. And KD, I think, is still probably a top 5 player. Book outplayed him in this run, but I thought KD overall had an awesome playmaking season, had a very good defensive regular season, and is one of the 3 best scorers alive. Like, yes, too reliant on his pull-up jump shooting, and I think that that can apply to both of them. They're not going to have a massive defensive impact. They're not consistently elite playmakers, although they are both pretty darn good there. But it's the best shot-making duo, one of the best scoring duos that we have ever seen. And I think if they had a better supporting cast around them, they could have done some really special things in this run. So I think that they have to be number 2 for me.
Yeah, they're number 2 for me as well. And again, Kevin Durant, people love to, in retrospect, we always look at the playoffs and the playoff result, and everybody bases their next year's predictions based on this year's playoffs. Kevin Durant still, guys, had the most efficient 29-point-per-game season of all time. It was unrivaled shot making. I feel like people are going to forget about that. We're going to go next year, oh man, KD was so good during the regular season. You know, who cares? They lost in the playoffs. It still matters. And, I mean, you hit on it, dude. If they were in Boston, right, you sub Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum for KD and D-Book, and I'm taking the Celtics in the blink of an eye, man. You know, it's not even a thought. They're not scrapping for Game 6 and Game 7, man. It's wraps. They're in the finals now. But Devin Booker, I think, if they had a better supporting cast, I think they go deeper here. I think to hold the result of that series against the best offensive player on the planet, against a much better collective unit overall, is just disingenuous to what these guys are as individual superstars. Devin Booker is one of the best isolation, transition, pick-and-roll scorers in all of basketball. He's one of the best pull-up shooters in basketball. Same applies to Kevin Durant, man. And like I said, that's the big distinction I would make between these groups and others. You cannot overvalue offensive creation. It is that's the most important thing in basketball. And the Suns' offense, while they struggled at times, we knew that was going to happen. That's what happens when you're so predicated on pull-up jump shooting. They're going to be great. And next season, we're going to see that. Like, I expect the Suns' offense to be one of the best in all of basketball if they can just stay healthy. And if they line them up with a better supporting cast, somehow can move on from CP, move on from DA, give these guys reliable spot-up shooting, reliable defenders, guys that just play well off of them and are really effective, I think this team can make a legitimate run next season. I don't want people to hold their loss to the Nuggets solely against these two guys, because I just don't think that's the right way to think about basketball. I said coming into the playoffs, I thought they were the best duo in basketball. I was wrong. I think there's one duo that is concretely better because we saw them outduel them head-to-head, but KD and Devin Booker are still 2 of the best on the planet. And, yeah, I think people, like I said, man, I think people are a little too results-based. They might look at that and go, oh, they shouldn't be here. They got bounced in the second round. It's deeper than that, and they're better than that. They're 2 of the best offensive players on the planet.
I'm with you there all the way. But The number one duo, Logan, I think has gone out there and grabbed that title, and that is Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic. And I think we got to start with Jamal because he's really the only question mark that you could raise, I guess, in this ranking. Like, is he of the caliber as a number 2 to justify this number 1 spot overall? But I think that he absolutely is, because I think he's one of the best pure scorers in basketball. That's a title that he has earned himself. 28 points per game on 60% true shooting in this run. Dominant efficiency out of the 2 primary categories that you probably look at for a guard. First of all, by far the most important, pick and roll scoring. He's 90th percentile. And then isolation, lower frequency, but 81st percentile in these playoffs. And as we said, one of the most special shot makers alive in shot making scales, because it doesn't require anything other than you going out there and getting to your normal spots and getting buckets. 52% from mid-range, 39% on pull-up threes. So right away, any pick and roll, he is able to get to one of those 2 spots and kill you very efficiently. Handoffs, right? He is going to be nails from deep. He's 42% on catch and shoot threes. And there's a level of consistency that legitimizes this, because he's gone for 25 plus in 10 of 15 games. And he did this last playoff run in the bubble. And now I think he's a little bit better overall. And his playmaking has been mostly pretty good. Like, yes, there are times where he can get suckered into, okay, I'm the hot hand, I'm just going to shoot the ball no matter what. But Logan, there's something crazy about that man where when he's in that zone, he's actually probably going to torch you. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a downside to it and that sometimes he can take the offense, which is so beautiful and flowing, out of its rhythm a bit, but I think it's far outweighed by his special shot making. So how do you ignore that? How do you value the regular season production where, yeah, he's not going to be in the same echelon as a lot of these other guys, over the playoffs where he consistently is dueling these guys, out shooting these guys, and going toe-to-toe with the best of the best at the guard spot? I'm just not going to be the one to do that. I love Jamal Murray. I literally own a shirt that says this guy loves Jamal Murray. I'm not a Denver Nuggets fan. I've owned this shirt for about 4 years. My friend got it for me.
Longer than that.
Maybe longer than that. He's a great basketball player, and he's a beautiful basketball player, and Nikola Jokic is the best player alive, and I think that's the separator, right? KD, Book, these guys are top 10 players, but they're both liable to have off nights because of their reliance on pull-up jump shooting, and they're not going to dissect and dominate you with their playmaking every single game, whereas Jokic is going to dominate every single game. He's going to dominate on the glass. If his perimeter shot making isn't there, well then fine, he'll get to all of his floaters and his touch shots, and he'll just get a couple putbacks for free every single game because he's the best putback scorer alive, and he'll create some great transition looks for his teammates, and he will inevitably draw attention out of the post and just get 10 assists, create a bunch of quality looks for shooters and cutters. It just doesn't stop. He has the highest floor in the NBA because of that, because of his multifaceted offensive genius. He is one of the best pure shot makers in the league too. I don't want to take that away. And I think arguably the best scorer with his level of physicality and shot making and versatility, pick and roll, inverted pick and roll, running off of pin downs, right, as a cutter, and obviously as the best post scorer alive. He can just do it all, and he's in a different class offensively. And you mentioned Steph and Wiggins as an honorable mention. To me, Wiggins is too far down that list. I think I'd actually still go Draymond as their second best guy if he's still around. But Jamal's in a completely different class, and so that's why I can't quite put anybody in the top 5 duos if they don't feel like a duo. Mm-hmm. This is a duo, man, and this is a duo for the ages, and they are the best duo doing it right now.
100%. It reminds me of that post-game interview. It was very early in these playoffs, and they asked Jamal afterwards, like, how can you consistently keep doing this? When are the people going to wake up and realize? Jamal's like, what else do I have to do to prove myself? Jamal has been doing this for years on end. And so I think a lot of people are probably going to bat an eye and say, oh, Jamal isn't in these upper echelon of players. He's not even with – he doesn't belong in this conversation. The one edge that I'll add that I think Jokic and Murray have above these other duos, Carson, is their collective synergy, right? There are some redundancies with all of these other duos, right? A Tatum and a Brown. They're both really effective with the ball in their hands, but they're not great off-ball guys who can play off of each other. Giannis and Drew Holiday. Neither of them are great individual offensive engines, again, and you don't really see, I know Giannis is a great role man. The Bucks need to run more of it. You don't see a whole lot of that with Drew and Giannis. AD and LeBron, right? Two bigs. It's kind of hard to run offense with both of them. KD and D-Book. Again, redundancies where they're not as effective off ball. Jimmy and Bam, same thing. They're just not at that level offensively. Jokic and Murray are great individual pieces. Murray's one of the best difficult shot makers in basketball. Jokic is flat out the best player in basketball. But you can run so much action between the both of them. If that's Jamal running pick and roll, if that's Jokic running pick and roll and Jamal setting the screen, if that's Jamal moving off ball and relocating, if that's running DHOs, like, to me, that's one of the deciding factors between this duo is that they can play so well off of each other in the way I don't think any other duo in the league can. Like, I think they are, and I know this is like stereotypical, this is kind of head-ass, they're like two perfect fitting puzzle pieces. I can't think of a duo that just fits better together. It's the best fit in my opinion. Call me crazy. And I think that there is a talent discrepancy between these two and Jokic and Murray, but like reminiscent of like how Curry and KD fit together in Golden State when they were running together. Like, I think that there's just a great fit here. And that's no disrespect to Jamal, too, because I think Jamal's a top 15 guy in the league, and I think we need to start recognizing that when it comes playoff time. I mean, I'd say top 20 to 15, somewhere in there, man. Jamal's legit. And, yeah, they're my number one duo, too. Again, the offensive ceiling that these two guys can reach with such ease, nobody else even competes, man. There's levels to this. And, again, I think people are going to think we're being reactionary, Carson. I don't think people are going to agree with us. I think they're probably not going to agree with this, and Jokic and Murray won, but I think they are, and I think they've concretely proven it this run. Anytime they've been together in the playoffs, they've produced.
And this is a great team. We've talked about they have great offensive weapons, special catch and shooting with MPJ and KCP, and an awesome cutter and rim finisher in Aaron Gordon, and a great versatile do-it-all guy in Bruce Brown. Denver is looking like the best team in the league right now. It's not just about these two. I mean, it is about Jokic more than anybody else being the best player alive, but Murray is one of several very good offensive pieces, but he is a class above them because of how lethal he is creating for himself. These two Logan on the floor together in these playoffs, an offensive rating of 123.4, and Jokic individually is 30, 13, and 10 on 62% true shooting. It's historic greatness, and we got to acknowledge that. I think they're clearly the best offensive duo, and I just think if you're looking at, okay, who can make that two-way case, like Giannis and Drew, I think too flawed offensively in comparison to these two. I don't feel like it's an overreaction. I feel like Jamal has earned this level of respect on the playoff stage, and obviously, as has Jokic. So, other honorable mentions, PG and Kawhi, you said it, I think would be here if they had been available once at the same time in the last three playoffs, but they're not really eligible for this list right now, in my opinion. Same goes for like Brandon Ingram and Zion. If we actually saw them play half a basketball season, we could start to talk about them. Harden and Embiid, I think their playoff limitations are too real, especially for Harden. Embiid's playoff limitations are real, but he goes from being, whatever, a top 5 regular season player to like closer to 10th in the playoffs, whereas Harden is liable to just fall off a cliff and at any moment disappear offensively because he can't get downhill, because he can't finish against length. So shout out to all those, but I think that we had the same 5 here for a reason, and I think that we had the same number 1 for a reason. It's because they've earned it.